Our next speaker is an entrepreneur, and it seems he's so famous I couldn't even add him on LinkedIn. He had something like 1,500 and something followers, and it was so many it wouldn't even let me connect with you. So that's some indication that he's quite a popular speaker in the region. He's had a lot of companies with titles from Top Gun on through business development and co-founder. He has the latest company, Icorn, which is, I think, about packaging up some rules or processes or ideas around innovation to help startups and entrepreneurs succeed better with their ideas and their sort of USPs. And his speech is going to be about, I think, successes and focusing on successes, which I love, because we always hear, learn from your failures, but wouldn't it be sweeter to learn from our successes? So with that, let's welcome Linus up on stage and hear him out.
Thank you.
Okay.
It's a fantastic time we live in when it comes to leading evidence-based business development and venturing, because the emergence of new data makes it possible for us to challenge old truths. There is so much new data coming up that's available for analysis that we can completely question old truths and create contrasting views. So I'm going to do that today. I'm going to present a topic that you've probably heard lots of presentations about. We are going to talk about success for sure, but I want to question the ideas we have of how we learn from failure. And specifically, what you guys probably have learned over the past couple of years about the virtues of failure. And we've even heard some of that here today. So are you ready for that? Yeah. Great. There's one fundamental fact about failure that's extremely powerful, and probably the reason why we're a bit hung up talking about failure. It's the only emotional experience that's shared between all of mankind. Every person on the planet experiences failure. Not everyone experiences success. Not everyone live their dream. Not everyone fall in love. But everyone fails from time to time. It's a natural part of life. It should not be stigmatized. Very important. And that's a fact. But that's also where the facts that we use to talk about failure that's the end of the facts-based conversation. After this, we go into wishful thinking, traditional beliefs, and just plain stubbornness about what failure can give us in terms of value. So, how many of you have been told at some point that you will learn from your mistakes? That should be all your hands should be up. I'm sure people have told you you will make mistakes and learn. When I run into quotes like this, I always ask myself, whom are they for? Make mistakes, learn from them, laugh about them, and move along. Is that for a brain surgeon? Is it for my financial advisor? Probably yes, that's for him. Is it for an engineer constructing a bridge? Is it for an Airbus A380 pilot? It's not a very inclusive idea, yet it's something that we run into all the time. I'm going to look a bit at data and our history to challenge this view. First of all, to measure the knowledge that we have acquired from failure is a very difficult thing. You can't really measure the knowledge. What you might be able to measure, at least if we talk passively, what you might be able to measure is the effect that you get out from acquired knowledge. So if you make a mistake, can we measure that what you do after that mistake, when you do this thing again, has a better outcome? Now, before I show you some data, I'm going to spell out what it says and what it doesn't say. So it does not say that you can't learn from failure, because you actually can. And all of us knows this. We have all learned from our failures at some point. What it does say is that there is no natural way that we learn from our failures, especially not more when it comes to more complex concepts, and especially not those who have unique outcomes. So let's begin with the observable post-failure effect from something we know pretty well: startups. So over a 5-year period, there's an 18% survival rate, success rate in startups. This is HBS data. Your second startup, if you fail the first one, has a 20% survival rate. So the performance effect here is only 2%. If we look at this from a more personal perspective, let's look at marriages. 5 years in, 20% are divorced. When those people remarry 5 years in, 30% get divorced within 5 years. There's an unlearning effect from failure, or maybe not, but at least the relative effect is not higher. This is interesting, I think. If you look at industries and failure, in some industries you can see large failure events, and then if there were a natural learning effect from failure, you could argue that after that event the industry would have learned and performed better. So if you look at VC pre-dot-com crisis and post-dot-com crisis, you would expect a performance increase if the industry actually learned from their failure. But what you see is a much poorer performance after the crisis. And since this is a relative measurement, of course it has to do with many different things, but at least there's no support from the learning by failure idea. So there's another reason why we are being trapped, or this learning from failure idea is an illusion. And that's because it's clouding our view of the most successful and effective way of learning that was ever discovered. So when we think about learning from failure, how to value failure, fail better, fail forward, etc., we're missing to learn from our own successes and to learn from the successes of masters and their victories. And this is the oldest form of education and learning that exists. It's also historically the most discussed form of learning. If we look at the book where this is from, the Bible, New Testament, this is basically the story of 12 people learning from one master who's considered the most successful person ever to have lived on earth. And if you take the Quran, it's the same story. It's you're supposed to learn how to live a successful and righteous life from a religious perspective, of course, by studying and understanding the ways of the prophet. And actually, apprenticeship, the study of masters, has been around for as long as there's been the idea of professions. So if you look at historical data or stories about learning, there is probably more than 10-to-1 ratio between success stories and failure stories. Actually, if we look at the occurrence of the world failure over the last 200 years, there's been a tremendous increase in talking about failure. We should also look at data for the observable post-success performance effect. If I stand here and say, there is a better way, and it's to study success. This again is very difficult to passively measure. We measure this actively every day in schools, have you learned what you were supposed to learn from someone who knows better than you? But to measure it passively, to see if it's natural, is more difficult. Again, we looked at startups, something that we know pretty well in this room. And it turns out that if you succeeded with your first startup, there's a 12% boost to your second startup. And you can argue if this is learning or if it's some other effect. I would argue that there is a learning component in that effect. Similarly, we looked at Kickstarter campaigns where there is a very significant boosting effect if you indeed succeed with your first campaign. And something we're looking at now, but it's too early to present, is in sports. If you win a title, how much, what are the probabilities that you will actually win another title compared to if you haven't won it before? Thirdly, and this to me I think is the most important note, who in here has got synaptic cleft strategy to become more successful? Only me. So what is the synaptic cleft anyway? This is an empty space in the brain in between the sending and receiving surfaces of the synapses. So when you form a thought, a specific neuron sends a chemical substance over this synaptic cleft through which an electrical charge can travel and form a thought. And when you think about a specific concept, and especially with an emotional charge, a specific set of neurons and their corresponding synapses in the brain react. Okay? Here's the catch. When you think repeatedly about things like this, and especially with an emotional charge, the brain reacts by narrowing the space, the synaptic cleft, in the particular synapses involved in that particular thought pattern. So it becomes easier for the brain to think about failure, and it becomes more likely for the brain to think about failure the more you try to learn from it. So the risk is that when you encounter a situation where there is an association with failure or success, you become more likely to think in a failure type of mindset. So my strategy, since I have got the idea to talk about failure to people, is really to engage in more thinking of success, more study of success, more practice of success every day. So after this presentation, I want to talk about success with all of you. Now, can we learn from failure? I already said that yes, we can, of course. And I think it's a very good idea to try to structure how we think we can get knowledge out of failure. And a concept that all of us knows very well, I think, is the black box idea from the aviation industry, where you record everything that's happening, and if there's a failure, you can learn from all the data you have. However, this case is not representative for most businesses. Not failing in the aviation industry is the same thing as succeeding. But that's not the case in most of our businesses. You can fail in so many different ways and succeed in a few other ways. And this is the core of the illogic of the natural learning from failure idea. So let's revisit an epic failure story that I think most of us know, the Blockbuster and Netflix story. So in the early 2000s, Blockbuster had the opportunity to buy a startup called Netflix for $50 million, and they didn't do that. And in the coming years, of course, Netflix and other factors too, but very much Netflix, made Blockbuster go under. So what can we learn from this management mistake? Well, the only thing we can learn, the only thing, is that they made the wrong decision. But if we think that buying Netflix was the right decision, we don't know the correct answer. Would Blockbuster have become what Netflix is today? We don't know. Would video streaming still be a nascent technology? We don't know. We only know what we should not have done, but not what we should have done. So to illustrate this, take a look at this illustration of 5 decision trees over 5 years for 5 startups. 4 of them failing and 1 of them succeeding. Every node in every decision tree is dependent on the decisions you did before. If you move up, it's a positive decision. If you move down, it's a negative decision. If you want to learn by studying everything up in this corner, you can spend a lifetime doing that. And the only thing you will have learned is what not to do. If you instead focus on the success stories in life, you will actually learn how you can do things and be successful. And it will also be a much more narrow sample to study. So this is the logical reason why I think that business development initiatives and startups should really focus more on success and the study of success rather than talking so much about failure. By the look of your faces, I think most of you are ahead of me right now, and you're thinking, where is this going? For example, the pharma industry makes, hundreds of failures before they actually succeed. This guy here is thinking, did this guy take one of those failed experimental pills before he went on stage? That's a fair question, sir. Of course, I think we need to talk about innovation and failure in this context. And the pharma industry is indeed a very good example. But let's instead talk about an iconic entrepreneur and a more innovator and inventor, Thomas Edison, for this. And that's because in the literature, the authors and the bystanders they came back to this concept for Thomas Edison over and over again, that he failed hundreds or even thousands of times for everything he invented. He failed and failed and failed, and then he discovered something new. Edison himself said things like, I have not failed 700 times. I have not failed once. I have succeeded in proving that those 700 ways will not work. So, what's the difference between Edison not recognizing this as failure and everyone else thinking that he failed 700 times? The big difference is that he defined what he was going to learn by doing what he was setting himself out to do. He was experimenting. He was engaging in scientific methodologies, not wishful thinking, not chance, not poor planning. In fact, Edison saw himself as a scientist, inventor, and entrepreneur. And this is a big difference, of course. I think it's very bizarre that modern literature for innovation efforts, for management of more agile organizations, etc., refer to Edison as the archetype entrepreneur and innovator that failed and failed and failed, and then he succeeded. Therefore, our organizations need to adopt a fail-forward culture so we can be more innovative. And then Edison himself thinks that I never failed at anything. It's a very bizarre thing that it exists in our teaching today. And then you might think, this guy is just marking words at stage. And fairly, yes, I would say I do, to some extent, but there is a deeper implication too. And I think that, the doctor, the surgeon, should have an intellectual tool, it should be equipped with an intellectual tool to discover new things without believing that he or she have to fail to learn. I think the same thing for this financial advisor I have. I think the same for the engineer or the A380 pilot. And we're talking so much in society today about failure as a means of learning and study. So what we need to stop doing is talking about random failure as a good source of learning, because there's not data supporting that it's true. Learning from random failure gives us random knowledge at best. What we need to do is unlock the awesome powers that already Thomas Edison knew in sandbox experimentation and scientific methods of discovering new innovations, creating new value, working with business development. A defined experiment means defined knowledge, at least, because the experiment may also be successful, and then you have your success. So the study of Edison is not the study of repeat failure or other people like Thomas Edison. It's the study of scientific methodologies, evidence-based innovation and improvement of the world. And that's the core of what we call enterprise ignition in Acorn. The capability to start new ventures or revitalize old ones with evidence-based methodologies. And I think that's the message that I want to leave you with today. Thank you very much.